He took to the skies when the sky was burning and the world was collapsing. They called it plywood. They laughed at its old-fashioned appearance. But it was this plane that met the enemy face to face when others were still standing in crates in factories. It would catch fire in the air from a single bullet, yet it still went head-on. Its pilots ascended into battle, knowing they might not return, and yet they pulled the stick up. This aircraft outlived an era, becoming a symbol of despair and courage. And its creator was a man who managed to make plywood fly faster than steel. What was behind the legend of the Soviet fighter that withstood the first strike from the sky? And why is it still called the machine that saved the country? In the early 30s, the sky became an arena for the clash of ideas and speeds. Countries, recovering from economic turmoil, sought to prove their superiority to the world, not only on the ground, but also in the air. The USSR didn't want to be left behind. Behind the closed doors of design bureaus, bold projects were born, machines capable of breaking the boundaries of the possible. At this time, the name Nikolai Polikarpov became almost legendary. He was already famous for creating reliable biplanes, but now he dreamed of something completely new. A fighter that wouldn't just fly faster than the wind, but would become a symbol of a new era of Soviet aviation. He drew the contours of the future on blueprints, where the lines of the fuselage resembled an arrow, and the propeller, a heart ready for battle. The machine turned out to be unlike any existing one. A small, dense fighter with a closed cockpit, retractable landing gear, and a speed that one could only dream of then. For the 30s, it was a breakthrough, as if from the future. Polikarpov understood that his brainchild would be a challenge to all the old concepts of air combat. When the first prototypes took to the sky, even seasoned pilots froze. The plane didn't just fly, it surged forward, as if striving to prove that man and machine could now become a single organism. At the same time, it was daring, sharp, and demanded a firm hand. The one who sat at the controls had to be able not just to fly, but to feel its every lurch, every vibration. Young pilots, accustomed to gentle biplanes, often got lost when the I-16 was tossed around by the wind like a wild colt. But those who managed to tame this metallic beast could no longer give it up. The speed reached 350-370 km/h, a fantastic figure for that time. Its maneuverability was astonishing. Pilots could perform such turns and loops that previously seemed impossible. In the air, it was like a living thing. It reacted instantly to every movement of the hand, as if anticipating the pilot's intention. And all this with a flight range of 680 kilometers and a ceiling of over $7,000 mem. For a country where aviation was just getting on its feet, this was a miracle. Every new flight became an event. Engineers, military men, and officials gathered at the airfields. Everyone wanted to see how the Soviet machine left foreign competitors behind. Polikarpov was troubled by doubts and responsibility. He knew that years of testing lay ahead, and that this fighter had to become not just a record breaker, but a foundation for a whole generation of pilots. The first versions were armed with a pair of Ishak machine guns, light but fast-firing. They were enough to turn an aerial battle into a whirlwind of fire. In the hands of an experienced pilot, this plane turned into a predator, ready to rush into attack from any direction. But every success was followed by an understanding. The machine required not just skill, but a new school of piloting. Old techniques no longer worked, and the familiar maneuvers were replaced by new, ragged ones bordering on madness. The I-16 fighter proved to be not only a technical, but also a psychological breakthrough. It changed the perception of what air combat should be, forcing pilots to think faster, to feel danger more acutely. This plane became a mirror of the era's character: rapid, unstable, willing to risk everything for a step forward. But while it shone in demonstration flights and amazed the public, storm clouds were already gathering on the horizon. The world was entering a decade when the sky would cease to be an arena for demonstrating achievements and would become a battlefield. Soon, this light, swift machine, born from a dream of the future, would be forced to test its strength in a real hell. It received a simple, even slightly mocking nickname, Ishak, donkey. But behind that word lay respect. Small, squat, with a short fuselage and a powerful engine. It resembled a stubborn animal, ready to endure anything for the sake of victory. Pilots said, "If you learn to fly this, you can fly anything." And that was no exaggeration. The first modifications, still with 2 machine guns and the M22 engine, were a sensation for their time. In the 30s, a plane capable of accelerating to speeds that even foreign engineers spoke of with disbelief seemed almost fantastical. In the air, it didn't fly. It seemed to dive, glide, break into a turn with such ease that observers on the ground couldn't believe their eyes. Its maneuverability allowed for aerobatic figures inaccessible to biplanes, which had previously been considered the pinnacle of flying skill. The I-16 did not forgive mistakes. Its short wing, high stall speed, and demanding character made it a real test. Young pilots, accustomed to the smoothness of old machines, often lost control, entered a spin, or couldn't handle the center of gravity in their first flights. But those who managed to tame this fighter felt like gods of the air. It obeyed the slightest hand movement, reacted instantly to the controls, allowing the impossible to be done in battle. Polikarpov and his team didn't stop. The machine was reinforced, simplified for maintenance, armor was added, and the engine was changed. The I-16 Type 5 appeared with the M25A engine, more powerful and reliable. Its speed increased to 440 km/h. This was no longer just an airplane. It was a weapon that had to prove its strength in a real war. Pilots were delighted. They said it went into a combat turn so sharply that the enemy simply lost sight of it. Its lightweight and powerful engine allowed it to literally jump out of the way of a blow and instantly change course. But all this came at a cost. The structure was fragile. The plywood skin did not always withstand overloads, and the fuel lasted for a short time. Every sortie required precision, calculation, and steel nerves. In those years, the USSR sought to show the world that it was capable of building technology no worse than the West. The I-16 became the main proof. It embodied the audacity of the designers and the courage of the pilots who for the first time felt they could compete with the best. But along with the enthusiasm came an understanding. This machine required a completely new generation of pilots. Old schools couldn't cope. The I-16 demanded intuition, agility, and the ability to feel speed not by instruments, but by the body. In the sky above Soviet airfields, it looked like a living creature. When the engine roared, the propeller blurred in the air and the fuselage trembled from tension. It seemed to breathe. It became not just a combat machine, but a symbol of man's desire to conquer the elements. Everyone who took it into the sky knew, this plane does not forgive fear. It accepts only those who are ready to fly to the end. But very soon, it would have to test itself in a real battle, where demonstration maneuvers would be replaced by a deadly dance in the air, and the enemy would be man, not time. Spain became the I-16's first real battlefield. There, under the scorching sun of Castile and amidst the dust clouds where the Civil War split the country in two, the Soviet fighter showed itself for the first time not at parades, but in a skirmish. In the autumn of 1936, the first batches of these machines secretly arrived in Spain disguised as hunting planes. Red stars appeared on the fuselage, and in the cockpits were young Soviet volunteer pilots who were awaited by their first real aerial battles. They had barely gotten used to the foreign sky when they encountered an opponent whose planes seemed to be the embodiment of another era. On the German side were Messerschmitt fighters, still few in number, but already heralding a new era. Their pilots, operating under Spanish markings, came here not just to help the Francoists, but to test their own machines and the tactics of future wars. From the first skirmishes, it became clear that the Soviet fighter was considered a marvel of engineering for a reason. It was faster and more agile than most opponents, and in the hands of experienced pilots, it turned into an unpredictable whirlwind. Its maneuverability allowed it to literally spin the enemy around, forcing close combat where speed was everything. German pilots felt for the first time that they were up against not primitive biplanes, but a machine capable of engaging in an equal fight. However, the sky of Spain forgave neither mistakes nor overconfidence. Every day brought discoveries and losses. The I-16s easily went on the attack, but were just as easily set on fire by a direct hit. The plywood skin, soaked in varnish and gasoline, flared up instantly. Pilots knew that the chance of surviving such a hit was negligible, but they went into battle again. They believed in their machine. They believed in speed and maneuver. The experience in Spain proved invaluable. Soviet engineers received reports from the front, where pilots detailed the Ishak's strengths and weaknesses: outstanding maneuverability, sufficient power. The ability to quickly change the direction of attack was a huge advantage, but at the same time, the weak construction, tendency to catch fire, and short flight range were drawbacks. These notes became a kind of roadmap for future modernizations. The battles for Madrid and Guadalajara turned into a school of new warfare. It was there, amidst the wreckage and smoke, that the first tactical techniques were formed, which would later become classics of Soviet aviation: sudden dives, attacks from the sun, sharp turns with loss of altitude. Pilots learned to act by instinct, not by instruction. The Spanish sky became an arena of maturation for them, where every mistake cost a life. Polikarpov, receiving the reports, understood. His brainchild had proven its strength. The plane had withstood the test, showing that it was capable not just of flying fast, but of winning. But he also saw the impending threat. German engineers were not sleeping. They analyzed the battles, improved the engines, and strengthened the armor. Their Bf-109s were already becoming faster, sturdier, and more dangerous. The I-16 returned from Spain as a hero, but with scars. It proved that it could be the best, but also made it clear that time was working against it. The war in Spain was a rehearsal for the coming nightmare, and those who flew there knew that the sky ahead would be even darker. After Spain, the fate of the I-16 changed definitively. Now it was not just Polikarpov's experiment, but a serial combat fighter upon which the security of an entire country depended. Factories began working in 3 shifts, assembling dozens of planes every day. At airfields across the country, young pilots learned to fly this temperamental machine, and enthusiastic headlines appeared in newspapers. The Soviet sky is under the protection of high-speed fighters. The main goal became one: to make the I-16 faster. The M22 engine was replaced by the new M25A, more powerful, more reliable, and more fuel-hungry. The speed increased to 440 km/h, which seemed like an incredible achievement. The plane surged forward, squeezing everything possible out of its engine, but every extra kilometer of speed came at a high price. The light structure, plywood fuselage, and fabric covering turned the fighter into a machine where every detail lived on the edge. Polikarpov understood that ideally the plane should be metal, but metal was scarce in the mid-30s. Duralumin went to heavy bombers, and the fighter had to settle for wood and compromises. The designer did not lose heart. He invented new assembly technologies that allowed production to be accelerated and repairs to be simplified. Workers without high qualifications could assemble I-16s right in the workshops, where the noise of hammers never stopped day or night. But this simplicity came at the cost of quality. There was a difference between machines assembled at different factories, which was rarely officially discussed. Some instances flew like lightning, while others barely reached the factory specifications. In tests, the speed difference could be up to 30 km/h, an abyss in air combat, where the winner is the one who is a fraction of a second faster. Reliability also failed. During sharp maneuvers, the thin plywood cracked, the covering peeled off, and the wings, overloaded with speed, sometimes lost stability. Pilots called this the song of tension, a special sound when the fuselage began to shake from overloads. Whoever heard it knew, a little more, and the plane might not hold up. Fire hazard remained a perpetual threat. The tanks lacked a vapor neutralization system, and if a shell hit, the flames flared up instantly. Pilots joked bitterly, "He who flies the I-16 is already halfway to heaven." But this phrase did not sound like fear, rather like an acknowledgement. They knew the price of speed and were ready to pay it. Polikarpov did not give up. He refined the machine, improved the aerodynamics, changed the armament, and strengthened the structure. But each modification brought new problems. The I-16 was still fast, but its limits were already felt. The air was getting thicker, the competitors stronger. The world was rushing ahead, and the new century of aviation demanded not compromises, but decisive steps. And while thousands of these plywood arrows continued to take to the sky, their fragile hum echoed a question that Polikarpov asked himself more and more often. Will this plane, born of a dream, be able to withstand the storm that is already bearing down on the country? The second half of the 30s turned the sky of Europe into an arena of a hidden race. Germany was rapidly building up its military might, and behind every demonstration of its power stood the shadow of a new fighter, sleek, metal, with an aggressive silhouette and the light gleam of aluminum in the sun. Its name was the Messerschmitt Bf-109. While Soviet factories were producing plywood I-16s, Germany was already betting on metal, on a new philosophy of war where speed and altitude decided the outcome of the battle even before the first shot. The Soviet Union watched, prepared, but was running out of time. Polikarpov understood that his brainchild was created in a different era, in years when such powerful engines did not exist, and the question of total war had not yet arisen. However, everything had changed now. Germany was testing the new DB600 and DB605 engines, increasing the power of the armament, making the cockpits pressurized, and strengthening the armor. Their fighters were becoming faster, more stable, and more technologically advanced. In comparison, the I-16 looked like an old warrior, experienced but tired. It could still perform maneuvers inaccessible to heavy German machines, but it was increasingly losing in speed. Its engine roared to the limit, but couldn't squeeze out more than 400-something kilometers per hour. The Germans went higher, to an altitude where the plywood Soviet fighter was already gasping for air. However, in the hands of Soviet pilots, the Ishak remained a dangerous opponent. Its light structure allowed it to turn on a dime, evade attacks, and suddenly change direction. It could, like a frightened bird, dive down and immediately climb up again, forcing the enemy to lose aim. Even German aces admitted that in close combat, this Soviet plane was like Mercury. Catching it was almost impossible. The main difference between the opponents lay not only in technology, but also in people. German pilots who had been through Spain and Poland had rich combat experience. They had already flown in the skies of Europe, confident in themselves and their machines. Soviet pilots, on the other hand, were only preparing for the big war. They trained at old airfields, practiced attacks on mock-ups, analyzed theoretical mistakes, but they lacked the most important thing: real battles against a strong enemy. Meanwhile, the Messerschmitts were practicing group combat tactics. The Germans introduced the pair system for the first time, leader and wingman, where one attacks and the other covers. This simple idea revolutionized the concept of aerial warfare. Soviet pilots still operated according to the old scheme, in flights of 3 machines, which often resulted in chaos in battle. Behind the scenes was a battle of engineers. Polikarpov and his designers tried to squeeze everything possible out of the plywood. They strengthened the fuselage, installed new engines, improved the armament, but every step forward was limited by the country's material capabilities. Germany, however, had already established serial production of all metal fighters, and the pace of their technical progress became threatening. It was at this moment that the invisible symbol of the confrontation was born: the shiny steel Bf-109 against the matte, plywood I-16. One, the embodiment of the technological power of industrial Germany; the other, the persistence and endurance of the Soviet school. They were born of different worlds, but they were destined to meet in the same sky. No one knew then that soon this sky would split into 1,000 lines, and a fine line would run between them, the line between speed and resilience, between cold calculation and desperate faith in victory. June 1941 began with a silence, deceptive and thick, like the air before a storm. Flights of I-16s were on duty at the airfields of the Western military districts. Pilots smoked on the wings of their machines, discussing the latest news, unaware that in a few hours the sky would ignite with thousands of fiery lines. When the first explosions tore through the morning air, the ground trembled. What no one was ready for had begun. German bombers came in dense groups, covered by the latest Messerschmitts. Their formation and precision seemed impossible. Against them, the I-16s rose into the sky, old, noisy, with engines overheating after every sharp maneuver. They didn't have time to gain the necessary altitude. Their speed was less, their armament weaker, but they took off anyway. The first battles were not a clash of machines. It was a collision of worlds. Pilots in I-16s took off from airfields that were already under attack. They often took off directly through the flames and smoke from broken runways, where their comrades were burning nearby. The Germans acted according to all the rules of the new war. lightning fast, cold-blooded, and coordinated. Soviet pilots responded with what they had: desperate determination and faith in their machine. Scenes that would later become legend took place in the skies over Brest, Minsk, and Smolensk. Single I-16s rushed at whole flights of the enemy, went into head-on attacks, fired until the last bullet, and rammed opponents when ammunition ran out. Their plywood bodies burned, but they did not surrender. Each battle turned into a short, blinding moment, a flash of courage that was later recalled with a shudder. Pilots knew their planes were obsolete. They saw how the Messerschmitts gained altitude faster, how German cannons pierced the skin with a single hit. But even when the outcome of the skirmish seemed obvious, the I-16s took to the air again. They didn't need victory, they needed time. Every minute snatched from the enemy gave the front a chance to reorganize, the factories to start producing new machines, and the country to hold out. Many of those who took off in those June days did not return. Their time in the sky was short but bright. They went into the clouds where plywood wings whistled with speed, where the air was full of smoke and radio cries, where the ground beneath them was already burning. But they went into battle anyway, because they knew that behind them were cities, families, and the country. The Germans were amazed by the ferocity of the resistance. Their reports included notes about mad Russians who were not afraid to ram. They did not understand that this was not madness. It was the realization of the end, met with a raised head. Thus, the plywood I-16s, created in peacetime, found themselves at the very center of the apocalypse. And although their age was coming to an end, they were the first to take the blow without fear, without doubt, with the perseverance that would later be called the spirit of the Russian sky. By the beginning of 1942, the country had changed. Factories that had recently produced plywood I-16s were now assembling new fighters: Yak-1, LeGG-3, and Il-2 attack aircraft. Technology had leaped forward, and plywood gave way to metal. But despite the official end of production, the I-16 did not disappear. It remained where wings were still needed. Though old, though tired, they were faithful. It could still be seen on the fronts. In the sky of Leningrad, where the air was saturated with smoke and soot, the I-16s escorted transport planes, conducted reconnaissance, and engaged in combat with an enemy that seemed superior in every way. They took off from icy runways with neither warmth nor cover, and every sortie was on the edge of the possible. In the harsh conditions of the blockade, where fuel was worth its weight in gold, these fighters continued to defend the city, as if ignoring that their era was already over. In the east, far from the main battles, they also served. Here, at airfields near Baikal and Primary, the plywood machines stood shoulder to shoulder with the new Yaks. They were cherished like veterans, entrusted with the most risky tasks: intercepting reconnaissance planes, escorting convoys, and patrolling the border. The old engines coughed upon startup. The propellers shook with vibration. But once in the air, the I-16 could still show its character. Many of its pilots had lived through an entire era. They started in Spain, went through the chaos of 1941, and now watched as shiny new planes appeared at the airfields. For them, the I-16 was not just a machine, it was a friend, tested in the sky and in fire. When they had to hand over their old fighters to cadets, they did so with special respect, as if handing over a part of their own destiny. In training regiments, the I-16 became the first school for future heroes. Cadets sat in its cramped cockpit, felt the vibration under their feet, and understood for the first time what real flight was. The machine was slow to forgive mistakes, but that's precisely why it taught responsibility. Whoever could tame the Ishak could handle any equipment. The last combat sorties of this legendary machine took place in the most difficult sectors of the war. In the Far East, it long remained on duty, guarding the borders when the main forces had already gone west. Its old engines hummed over the taiga like an echo of battles past. By the middle of the war, the I-16 became a rarity, but everyone who saw its silhouette in the sky recognized it immediately. Short nose, low wings, sharp lines. It looked tired, but proud. It departed quietly, without fanfare or parades, like old soldiers who had done their duty to the end. And even when new machines finally took over the sky, the name I-16 remained in the hearts of those who flew it. They knew that if it weren't for those plywood wings, the first blows of the war could have been the last. And so, every sortie of the old Ishak was not just a mission. It was an act of loyalty, proof that resilience is not measured by speed or metal. It wasn't the fastest, it wasn't the most powerful, and it had long ceased to be modern, but it remained in memory as a symbol of the beginning and of fortitude. The I-16 lived a short but vibrant life, full of risk, courage, and extreme tension. It became the bridge by which Soviet aviation crossed from the plywood era to the steel one. The future roared in its propellers, and the persistence of a people who did not know how to surrender sounded in its sputtering engine. When factories were already producing the new Yaks and LGGs and Il-2s were roaring over the fronts, the plywood I-16s stood on the secondary runways, like old veterans who remembered the worst. They endured what no machine of their time could have endured. The chaos of the first raids, the loss of airfields, the lack of fuel, faulty engines, destroyed runways, but they still took to the air, not because of an order, but because they couldn't do otherwise. It gave the country the most precious thing: time. Time to build new planes, train pilots, set up production, and organize the defense. While new designs were only being born on blueprints, the I-16 stood guard, shielding the sky like an older brother who takes the first blow so that the younger ones can grow up. The story of Polikarpov and his machine is a story of faith in the impossible. The designer, without resources or metal, managed to create a fighter that became a legend long before the war. His plywood brainchild showed that true strength is not always found in armor and power. Sometimes it lives in character, in persistence, in the ability to move forward when everything is collapsing. For pilots, the I-16 forever remained a friend and teacher. It forced respect, demanding precision, decisiveness, and complete trust. It had no forgiveness for the hesitant, but to those who understood it, it gave everything: maneuverability, reaction, obedience. Generations of pilots grew up on it, who would later lead new machines into battle, tempered with different metals, but with the same spirit that lived in the old plywood fighter. Today, when surviving examples of the I-16 stand in museums, people look at them with surprise. How could this small, simple machine become the hero of a great war? The answer is simple. It was created not only by the hands of engineers, but also by the belief that man can win even when the odds are negligible. It was the Ishak, stubborn, difficult, and indomitable. And it was he who took the first blow from the sky, stood firm, burned, but did not retreat. Its plywood wings became a symbol that resilience does not rust or age. It simply changes form, from wood to metal, from a fighter to a legend.